Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. 75 years ago, this year, on the 24th of March 1945, the largest ever airborne operation swung into action. Operation Varsity involved over 16,000 paratroopers and thousands of planes. The objective was to secure the west bank of the River Rhine and the bridges over the Issel. A successful crossing of the River Rhine would allow the Allies access to the northern German plain and ultimately to advance upon Berlin. Joining me today is James Fenelon. James served in the US Airborne before turning his hand to writing. He is the author of 4 Hours of Fury, which looks at Operation Varsity. It's a good read and does an excellent job of getting across the confusion of the situation for those men once they hit the ground on that day in 1945. Now, this podcast is brought to you with the kind contributions of fellow listeners. If you think there is a vast machine at work in the background with assistants, researchers and audio engineers all beavering away, paid for by a philanthropic millionaire, you would be wrong. It is just me. But I could use your help. All this costs me, and it's not just my time. Software and research material is an ongoing cost. How can I help, I hear you cry? Well, if each one of you tossed a shekel in my virtual tip jar at patreon.com/WW2podcast, I would have a pretty good monthly salary. But I appreciate not everyone has the luxury of spare change. But if you do enjoy the show every couple of weeks, why not go to patreon.com/WW2podcast and become a patron of the show. Think of it as like subscribing to a magazine, but rather than a piece of plastic tat you occasionally get taped to the front, I'll try and give you some audio extras from our chats when I have them. Bits left on the cutting room floor. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Now, on to the main feature. James, thanks for joining me. Operation Varsity and I guess Plunder. Shall we set the scene? The Battle of the Bulge is over by the end of January 45. The next major hurdle is the River Rhine. What is the situation on the ground?
The lines were starting to kind of come back together after repelling the Germans from the Ardennes and their incursion there in December. You know, I think what was facing the Allies at that point was the big decision at the top, where Eisenhower was really wanting to use the might and the breadth of their, over 50 odd divisions to kind of press the Germans all across the front simultaneously. And then, of course, you had, the more famous debate between Eisenhower and Montgomery. Montgomery advocated using a very strong single thrust to crack through the German lines up north. And so, for a while in the early spring of 45, there was kind of this lull, if you will, from a strategic perspective, while Eisenhower was hoping that his broad front strategy would kind of gain ground in one of those areas. Montgomery's 21st Army Group had approached the Rhine up to the north, just not far from Arnhem, as a matter of fact, just 40 miles upriver on the Rhine. The closer they got to Germany, of course, the advantage for the Germans at that point was their ability to react more quickly across their front, because, of course, they had shortened supply lines at that point. They had all of the advantages of the infrastructure within Germany from a road perspective that, despite Allied bombing, was still allowed them to move troops pretty quickly. And so you had that across the Rhine attempt to get across down south. The Americans were pushing up not far, and captured the bridge in Remagen.
If you think of that broad front strategy, and everyone is closing onto the Rhine at a sort of a similar time, why is it decided to give it to Monty? I mean, in some respects, you might say with the hindsight, he failed once. Arnhem was a problem for everybody. Why give it to Monty? Why not give Bradley a crack in the centre?
I feel sorry for Montgomery, because I feel like in a lot of ways he can't ever win. It's either he's either too conservative, or he's and then when he tries to do something interesting, he's too frivolous or too wild. But Eisenhower was giving Bradley a chance to get his army moving. They were running against stiff resistance. They weren't making the progress that they had wanted to. But to be fair, in Montgomery's area, the 21st 21 Army Group area, was the Ruhr, the industrial area of Germany. And so, to be fair, that really was where the opportunity to end the war earlier was, as opposed to down in the American sector. So in the Ruhr, you still had all of the German industry cranking out anti-aircraft guns, tank guns, self-propelled artillery, aircraft at an alarming rate. And you do have the challenges of, did they have the fuel and the manpower to actually do anything with them? But I think the strategy there was, if we cut off the Ruhr industrial area and we encircle that as our drive into Germany, that will actually be the bigger opportunity to cripple their warfighting capability.
Yeah, clearly, because Speer's doing wonders managing to keep everything being produced. As you say, it's fuel that becomes the problem. So we're looking specifically at at the airborne component of, it's Operation Plunder is the major is the whole thing to cross the Rhine. Varsity is the airborne component. I mean, who's to lead it? Obviously, we're increasingly as the war goes on, there's becoming some quite experienced airborne commanders since sort of Sicily, D-Day, Arnhem. Who's to lead Varsity?
Yeah, so at that point, the Allies had formed the first Allied Airborne Army to kind of consolidate that expertise that you had just mentioned, and to give them more of a strategic capability, consolidating all their airborne units, the troop carrier units, all the things necessary to actually execute one of these missions. And at the time when Plunder and Varsity was in its planning stages, the commander of the first Allied Airborne Army, a guy named Brereton, actually assigned the mission to the 1st Airborne Corps, the British 1st Airborne Corps, under the command of a general named Richard Gale, who I'm sure you know led the 6th Airborne into Normandy. And it kind of generated some controversy in 21 Army Group. Montgomery really wanted 18th Airborne Corps, the American Airborne Corps led by General Ridgway, to command the operation, because he felt that they had, one, more combat experience than the British Airborne Corps, and I think more importantly from his experience, a better signal capability. And of course, from Arnhem, one of the lessons learned from Market Garden was the importance of signals. And so there was kind of a tug of war there for a period of time where Ridgway didn't really want to command the mission. He felt that Richard Gale was more than capable of leading the mission. He felt that since it was largely a British operation, that British airborne troops should be predominantly used, and especially in the command function. And so there was a lot of back and forth, and ultimately through multiple appeals and complaining, Eisenhower actually was the one who kind of intervened and ensured that 18th Airborne Corps, led by General Ridgway, kind of had the overall planning capability. Ridgway did kind of quote unquote deputize Gale as his second in command, and they actually based a lot of what they were doing on Gale's original planning efforts for Varsity.
It's a wonderful example of when people get quite nationalistic about, about this period of the war and how you've got, an American commander wants a British commander to run it, and the British commander wants an American commander to run it. It's a wonderful example of actually the Allies trying to work out what's best between themselves without getting their knickers too much in a twist of whether he's British or American or how they just want what they feel to be the best guy for the job for them.
That's right. Yeah. And I think it's easy to kind of underestimate how hard it is to run a coalition. I mean, I think we look at it in hindsight and think, well, shouldn't everybody just be getting along? We're here to defeat the Germans. But obviously there's a lot of things that go into coalitions and how they're formed. And I agree. And it was interesting because I think it was a joint command, meaning that it was staffed by both British and Americans at the top. And then, of course, was made up of not only British and American units, but Canadian and some of the Polish airborne troops as well.
Yeah, cascades down. So, I mean, I guess once we've got the wrangling of the commander out of the way, the next wrangling is on how much of agreement was there on a plan. How much do commanders have different ideas on what's going to work?
So initially, Montgomery really wanted to drop 3 airborne divisions. The original plan was to drop the British 6th, the American 13th, and the American 17th airborne divisions. There's been a lot of kind of misinformation over the years about why they didn't drop 3, and that's largely historically said to come down to a lack of aircraft. But my research has kind of revealed that the reality was that Ridgway, as 18th Airborne commander, never fully got on board with the necessity of dropping a 3rd division. The idea was that Miles Dempsey wanted to drop 2 airborne divisions on the immediate other side of the Rhine, with an on-call drop for a 3rd division further inland. And Ridgway's concern at the time was, well, if you don't really have a solid plan for this 3rd division, my concern is that as you start to cross the Rhine, push the Germans back, they'll all be sitting there on the drop zone where you want to drop these guys. I'm of the opinion that this mission could be better accomplished but with ground infantry. So the 13th Airborne Division, which I think has the distinction of being the only American division that was in Europe that did not see combat, was on alert for Varsity, but didn't actually participate in it. And then you had the debate as to where to drop the two divisions. And I think, again, there a lot of lessons from Market Garden played into how Ridgway wanted to see that unfold. They wanted to make sure that they were close enough to where they could link up and not have any risk of isolating those troopers on the other side of the Rhine. They wanted ideally to drop them within artillery range. From the friendly side of the Rhine, there was over 5,000 artillery pieces arrayed on that side to support the crossing. And so then it really came down to how do you want to use them? And I think this was one of the things that I found interesting as I studied the operation. The airborne focus always tends to kind of be on the paratroopers. But Varsity really came down to the glider troops. And that was true for both the British and the American airborne divisions, because the mission came down to seizing a series of bridges further inland across the Issel Canal. The 6th Airborne had 3 bridges to seize, and then in the American zone, there was 10 bridges to seize. And that resulted in them dropping in a little closer to the Rhine than Ridgway originally had envisioned. It was almost more of a tactical use of airborne troops in this case than a strategic one, if you will.
There's also some debate over whether it's a day drop or a night drop, and at the same time whether they go when they go in. Do they go in first? Do they precede or? So
the first debate in that question was a day drop or a night drop. General Miley, who was commander of the 17th Airborne Division, was really advocating for a night drop. To be fair, Ridgway, who had a little bit more experience in these things at this point in the war than Miley did, advocated a daytime drop, not only just from a navigation perspective and all the hazards that are involved in that. At that point, the German night fighters were actually more of a threat than the Luftwaffe during the day. So there was concerns that if the night fighters got in there amongst the Armada while they were bringing them in, they could completely wreak havoc to all the transports and the gliders. And then when it came down to timing, it's kind of an interesting one. So, at the senior levels of command, the Allies had realized that the element of surprise had been lost. And so there was this, several instances of intercepting German communiques, confirming that the Germans expected Montgomery to drop airborne troops as part of his crossing, had a pretty good idea where those troops were going to be dropped. And so the idea was, well, since we've lost the element of surprise, maybe we can retain some of that if we change the order in which we traditionally conduct our operation. And so the idea was that normally they would drop airborne troops in advance of the crossing. In this case, the troops started crossing the night of March 23rd, morning of March 24th in the dark. They got across, and then the airborne troops dropped at 10 a.m. And this also gave the ability for Dempsey's troops and all the troops crossing the Rhine to enjoy several hours of full artillery support, which had to cease fire at just before 10 a.m. when the Armada came in order to avoid any potential fratricide.
We've sort of alluded to this, but I mean, Plunder is massive, but Varsity is huge as well. Considering should we look at the numbers involved? How many men are they trying to get in?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. Traditionally, the numbers have been estimated around 17,000. I was not able, when I looked into that, able to confirm that those numbers actually included the glider pilots, which in both circumstances were armed belligerents and should be counted. So my count brings it closer to 19,000 armed soldiers coming in on Varsity, if you include the glider pilots from both divisions. So the Armada itself was almost... Well, it was completely staggering in its size, right? It was over, close to 1,600 troop transports alone, pulling in over 1,300 gliders. And on the tail of that were 240 B-24 bombers that were rigged to drop supplies so that the supplies could be dropped immediately upon landing. Yeah, it was the largest armada ever assembled during the war, and it took over 3 hours for it to cross a single point on the ground. I mean, it's just staggering when you think about the logistics to get them all up into the air. They left from over, between France and England. They flew from over 20 airfields.
And they're trying to do it in one drop rather than two. Is that one of the lessons they'd learned from Market Garden? Try and get everyone in together.
Absolutely right. They wanted to do a single drop, and they also wanted. That was why the bombers were on the tail end of that with supplies. They wanted to do a single drop, and they couldn't get the transports turned back around to the airfields, get them loaded with supplies to bring them back in. And so one of the other lessons from Market Garden was not only just a single lift, but to also part of that single lift was to make sure that the troops were as well supplied as possible.
Staggering that they can dig up 3,000 sort of air transport aircraft between gliders and planes and everything else just to get everybody there in one lift.
Yeah, it's kind of a remarkable story of just cobbling them together. I mean, I don't know how many of those transports were necessarily 100% airworthy, but I know that they were digging up, the RAF was digging up bombers, and at the last minute, putting the hardware on them to pull the horse of gliders, and of course to man all those aircraft required crews. Not all the gliders that went in had fully qualified glider pilots flying them. A lot of guys were pressed into service, almost kind of against their will, if you will, to kind of go in by a glider.
It's not a job I'd like to be a glider pilot. There's a lot of them end up going straight through the front window when they come down, don't they?
That's right.
It's not very nice at all. But one of the solutions is, I've not quite made enough notes to get this across possibly the question, but the C-46 transport becomes part of the solution by it frees up the Dakotas, the Skytrains, the C-47s. To do.
That's right. So
tug work?
Yes, it did. Yeah, well, it kind of depends on what angle you look at it from. So to your point, the C-46 was new to the theater. They kind of rushed the pilots through their transition training to get them up to speed on flying the new aircraft. It had a number of advantages over the C-47 from a parachute operation perspective. The first was that it could hold twice the number of jumpers, so you could almost fit a full platoon, 36 guys, into a C-46. And the other advantage was that it had double doors, which meant that those 36 guys could exit much more rapidly than if they were jumping out of a C-47, which, of course, from a paratrooper's perspective means that they're exiting faster, they're exiting closer together, which means they're not as dispersed on the ground as they might have been, which is an advantage there for when they're trying to initially assemble. The downside to the C-46 was, of course, that at the time it was in the European theater, they did not have self-sealing gas tanks. And so they are incredibly flammable, susceptible to anti-aircraft fire, and several, I think at least 24 of them were shot down at the time as a direct result of that.
Amazing how simple they put an extra door on so you get your grouping of the parachutists landing together. How would it?
Yeah.
A very simple solution.
Absolutely.
But then the dual Dakotas can then pull two tugs, can't they? So you get in they could act as a tug to pull two gliders in at once. So you're doubling the amount of gliders in the go, which is remarkable.
That's right. And that was the other way that they kind of were able to significantly increase their lift capability, was by pulling in two gliders, which was initially resisted by some of the Troop Transport Command, had never done it before in combat. It's obviously a very dicey perspective from a pilot's perspective of trying to keep your glider out of the way of the other tow rope. And honestly, that was also another factor in going in daylight. It was considered that if we were going to do double tow on gliders, doing that at night would have been extremely dangerous.
We mentioned earlier that the Germans had, they'd obviously crunched the numbers. They'd looked at the map, and they'd come up with their own appreciation of where their allies they thought they'd be crossing the Rhine. What plans did they have in place for an anticipated Allied attack?
They had done their research. The guy that was largely in charge of the sector across from where the main plunder crossing was going to happen was a German general by the name of Alfred Schlemm. He had a pretty varied and wide military career that kind of gave him the ability to have a bigger appreciation for what was going on. He had participated, by way of example, in the planning for the German invasion of Crete. And so he had a deep familiarity with airborne troops and their weaknesses. And so his plan, as part of the anti-airborne plan, if you will, was he knew that airborne troops were at their most vulnerable immediately upon landing, before they were able to oftentimes get their heavier weapons into play, before they were able to establish their perimeter, maybe while they were running around trying to find their equipment containers. All the things that plagued all nations in the war of trying to figure out how to effectively drop troops. And so his plan was he formed a number of comp groups whose job was dedicated to an anti-airborne role. I think you can appreciate the German flair for being able to cobble together various units and assemble them from all over the place to form these comp groups. And that was true during Varsity as well. So a number of groups had these plans, and they were motorized with everything from bicycles to half tracks, really pulled together to their mission was to go attack directly into the forming paratroops as soon as they could land, or as soon as they were landing. And then, of course, the other thing was that he had no shortage of anti-aircraft guns. And so one of the big things that he ensured was making sure that the anti-aircraft weapons were not only well positioned to deal with any incoming aircraft, but also so that they could traverse their barrels horizontally and have a commanding presence over the suspected drop zones as well.
If we turn the tables from the Allied perspective, are they aware of what they're facing on the German side? I mean, presumably we're dominant in the air, so we could send over recon planes. But do we not actually know what we're facing on the other side of the Rhine?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question to ponder. I think part of the answer depends on who we're talking about specifically, right? So I think the troops themselves, I think from their big perspective, the thing that was on the top of their mind was that this was going to be an invasion, not a liberation. So all previous airborne operations had been conducted in occupied territory, where they were reasonably confident that the civilian population would be welcoming. And that wasn't really the case for Varsity. And so from a paratrooper or gliderman's perspective, who's going into Germany as part of this mission, their range of concerns ran from, am I going to get shot by a farmer with a shotgun, or, stabbed with a pitchfork while I'm trying to get out of a tree, all the way up to, is my aircraft going to get shot down? And certainly as part of those guys' preparations in the airfields where they were preparing, they certainly had access to daily updates on intelligence, and oftentimes could see the number of anti-aircraft weapons being brought in and emplacements being dug in some of those areas. And then I think, there was the traditional overestimation of how effective anti-aircraft bombing missions were, strafing missions. And so I think there was a lot of effort from an artillery perspective beforehand to try to take out those positions. Certainly a lot of airstrikes against those positions. which unfortunately always tended to be overly optimistic as to how effective they were.
Just before we get to Plunder and Varsity, there's the somewhat major hiccup, might not be a hiccup, but, of Courtney Hodges. The First Army captures, actually crosses the Rhine at Remagen at the Ludendorff Bridge. How much effect did that have on Plunder and Varsity? I think it's about a week, 10 days beforehand, they actually get this crossing across the Rhine. I mean, did that have any potential to scupper the operation and they switch?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up not infrequently. And I think it goes back to that idea around the Ruhr industrial area was really what Montgomery and Eisenhower's original plan encompassed, cutting off that area and really reducing the ability to produce the war material. Now, where Remagen was an important component of that was, of course, von Rundstedt had to react to that. He couldn't just let the Americans continue crossing across the Rhine in that vicinity. I think in the first 24 hours, they had over 8,000 troops across the bridge there at Remagen before it collapsed. And so, 8,000 guys is a material number that the Germans had to react to. And so I think the direct impact on Plunder and Varsity was that those troops had to come from somewhere. And so von Rundstedt was pulling troops out of the Wesel area away from the front in front of 21 Army Group and sending them south towards that area.
You get Patton the night before as well doing the similar thing, almost to steal Monty's glory.
Yeah, exactly. But I think if you look at the terrain on the other side where those guys were crossing, it didn't really facilitate the breakout that the northern crossing had envisioned. The terrain was just, it was very mountainous and not very conducive to the sweeping advance that the terrain on the north sector allowed.
So if we get to the operation itself, you get the gliders, you get the troop carriers in the air, they're sort of all rumbling over en masse. What's the biggest threat to them coming over? My assumption has been that the Luftwaffe is largely negated. Is that anti-aircraft gun? How much of a problem is anti-aircraft and flak to these carriers?
I think you nailed it. I mean, the Armada had over 500 fighter escorts bringing them in and ensuring the Luftwaffe stayed at bay. There was a massive effort the day before and the morning of to neutralize German airfields, particularly those airfields where they had jets, the Me-262. And so there was a lot of preparation of the battlefield, if you will, to deny the Luftwaffe a role in stopping the Armada, which, of course, left the anti-aircraft guns that were all arrayed throughout the area. And they did prove to be the biggest threat. The Germans had stripped a number of other areas to bring those anti-aircraft guns in. A lot of the crews at that point had been very experienced. And so in the days preceding, a number of crews opted not to take some of the bait of the airstrikes and remain silent, which, of course, meant that they avoided the attention of the airstrikes, if you will. And so they were in their positions and ready to fire when that Armada first started coming over the Rhine. And indeed, the first C-47 started taking fire before it even had gotten to the Rhine from those anti-aircraft positions.
And they're lower. They're coming in at, I presume, they're dropping them at 300 feet, which to me sounds ridiculously. I mean, you've jumped out of an aircraft with a parachute on. What do you jump at? 300 feet to me just sounds like you haven't got time for your parachute to open before you hit the floor.
Yeah, I think there was definitely some low drops. The average altitude was closer to 600, which gives you a little bit of time. But to your point, not much time at all. And a lot of guys opted to not jump with their reserve parachute. Other guys felt that the reserve parachute was nice to have and that it was a barrier to any potential flak that might come up. But certainly at 600 feet, if you have a malfunction, you're unlikely to get your reserve deployed in time.
You might not know this, but how long does it take to hit the floor from 300 or 600 feet from jumping out? Is it just rush up to you and you're there?
Yeah, I'm speculating. I would say that probably 45 seconds.
Is it that long?
Depending, maybe less.
Yeah, my complete ignorance is that you literally jump out. You're almost like your parachute goes up. You hit the floor and it falls down on top of you. It's that quick. It just seems really low to me. I'm not great with heights for a start, but yeah. 300 feet.
No, it's definitely low. And the idea was there again that the lower you could get, the less dispersion you would have upon landing. And of course, the other idea being that the lower you are, ideally, the less of a target you are.
And presumably these were all lessons that they've learned from Sicily, Normandy, Market Garden. Get the guys on the ground together, minimise that spread and confusion by men dropping all over the place.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there were, airborne commanders who were trying to demand that they drop as low as possible. To your point, several of those guys, several passes rather, push the envelope as to how low you could actually be to drop.
I get the impression it's a confused situation as they hit the ground, but not as confusing possibly as these guys might have otherwise encountered in previous drops. Do they seemingly get together, land in decent-sized fighting units?
Yeah, there's a couple of missed drops, but to your point, they organized quickly. So the first lift consisted of the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and I'm speaking here about the 17th Airborne Division. Those guys, of course, a large number of them had been veterans of the Normandy drop, so they were experienced from that perspective. And one of the things we haven't really chatted about that did impact the drop was 21 Army's group's use of smoke along the Rhine River. So the idea here was that along their 22-mile front where they wanted to cross the Rhine River, they had lots of smoke generators, the idea being that they would conceal the efforts on their side of the Rhine to prepare for the crossing. This, of course, frustrated German observers on the other side who were trying to see what's going on. The downside of this was that all that smoke drifted across the Rhine and obscured landmarks as the armada for Varsity was coming in. And so the lead serial for the 17th Airborne Division actually dropped the 1st Battalion of the 507th about 2 miles off of their drop zone, while the remaining 2 battalions and their artillery dropped in the correct drop zone. Now, it didn't take these guys long once they landed to figure out that they were in the wrong area. But again, that smoke on the ground kind of prevented that happening quicker in many cases. But the 507th quickly figured out that they had misdropped. Their commander, a guy by the name of Edson Raff, had insisted that they all jump with their radios attached to them as opposed to in equipment bundles from underneath the plane. And so the 507th really does a remarkable job of getting organized quickly, and Raff using radios to retask his units based on where they landed. So by way of example, these guys, the first serial that Raff landed near one of their objectives, Deersfort Castle, which was this German kind of compound surrounded by a moat that was actually assigned to one of the other battalions. Raff quickly reorganizes his unit based on where they've landed to get that attack in earlier than instead of waiting for it to get organized. The 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the 2nd Regiment in the 17th Airborne that was dropping further north, had a complete misdrop due to that smoke. These were the guys going in those C-46s. They actually ended up landing in the British zone, which had a unanticipated benefit in that when those guys landed and started to engage the Germans there and taking out those anti-aircraft positions that were firing on them from the drop zone, it aided the British gliders that were coming in because the German gunners then had to choose if they were going to shoot at the gliders swooping in or at the Americans who were swooping into their position on the ground. The 513th had not had the benefit of a previous combat jump. It took them a little bit longer to get oriented. They were up near Hammenclin and get turned around and then march back to their objectives.
So I got the feeling that you mentioned radios. The radio network actually seems to work for once, and the beauty of them actually dropping relatively close to the front line is that finally the radios work, and finally these scattered groups can call in artillery in large amounts when they get stuck, when they encounter something that's possibly beyond the means of light infantry to easily take out. Is that the case?
Absolutely right. Yeah, there was that period of time when the Armada was still in the air. Those B-24s were coming in on the tail. That that artillery from the other side of the Rhine was not available just because of the ceasefire in place while the aircraft came overhead. But shortly thereafter, they were definitely calling in support from what would now be the far side of the Rhine, as 21 Army groups. Like I said, they had over 5,000 artillery pieces. And where you really see that come into play and a benefit is for those glider troops along the Issel River and the Issel Canal to protect those bridges against German counterattacks, where the Germans are now trying to fight their way into the airhead. They're trying to reclaim those bridges. They've got tanks. They've got motorized infantry trying to get across that. And where you see the artillery really come into play is being radioed across, as you mentioned, and bringing that fire down upon those counterattacks in a very effective way.
Did they? I mean, you mentioned earlier the Kampf groups, and you just say they're now trying to counterattack back across these bridges across the Issel. How much of a problem is German armour to the airborne troops?
I think if you're an airborne troop, it's if you're an airborne soldier, rather, it's a big problem. No one likes to be faced with the business end of a Panther. If you're General Ridgway, the Panthers aren't that big of a problem, right? I mean, they're not in significant numbers necessarily to pose a huge threat. But again, if you're the guy with the bazooka on the bridge, it's a big deal. And there were enough of them to where, there was at every bridge, there were at least 2, 4, 5 tanks trying to get across and supporting the German infantry attacks. And there were a number of duels between bazooka gunners and tankers and the infantry trying to repel them back at those bridges.
You mentioned Ridgway there. Now, he doesn't jump in, doesn't he? Why is he not there at the start?
Yeah. So Ridgway crossed the Rhine via one of the amphibious tracked vehicles. There's a couple of different points of view on that there. Edson Raff, who was the commander of the 507th, was very bitter afterwards that Ridgway did not jump in with his troops. He viewed it as a very anti-airborne kind of macho stance, if you will. But there's a lot to be said for the fact that Ridgway didn't jump in, meaning that he and his staff did not take up vital aircraft space, right? So if you're jumping 2 divisions in, every seat on those aircraft should go to trigger pullers. And so he knew that. He also knew that the reality was that he wasn't, as a corps commander, going to be able to really exert any kind of influence on the battle in the initial stages, because the initial stages of the battle were basically a bar fight, just pandemonium. And so until things and perimeters got established and communications got established, he wasn't really going to be able to have an influence in that. So he came across the Rhine a couple hours later and then made his way towards first the 17th Airborne Division headquarters, and then with General Miley went and found General Bowles, commander of the 6th Airborne Command Post.
It sort of amuses me slightly, the idea of him sort of driving around his Jeep looking for his troops in presumably what must be still partly enemy territory, with pockets of airborne. And he's sort of brazenly driving around in his Jeep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I won't spoil it, but he does actually get into a firefight with his, Ridgway was kind of famous for carrying this bolt action Springfield.
Yeah.
And so he got involved in a firefight with a pocket of German resistance and actually was wounded.
Yeah. It's remarkable. Now, how was the German resistance? Was it as strong as the Allied expected?
Honestly, I think it was stronger. I mean, I think one of the criticisms of Varsity is the amount of casualties that were suffered as part of that. And there's a lot of interesting debate around whether or not it was necessary. And again, I think part of it is that they literally dropped these 2 airborne divisions on top of German positions. I mean, there was, stories of guys getting in shootouts through the roof of the building they landed on with the Germans who were down inside the building. So they literally landed on top of all the Germans that were in this area. And in the ensuing pandemonium, there was a lot of fierce fighting, because at that point it was one-on-one, it was survival. And so these German troops had a hard time. It put them in a position to where they really couldn't retreat in many cases, because they were literally enveloped. And so it kind of became a fight or flight kind of situation. And then on top of that, you've got all the anti-aircraft weapons that were there, which really, did damage to the aircraft. But then also when they were, when the barrels were lowered and fired in a horizontal manner, was also proved quite devastating.
Did you say that once these Germans are surrounded, they either stick it out, or I guess eventually they surrender when it's absolutely hopeless? What on earth do the airborne do with POWs? I guess traditionally you send them back from the front, but when to an airborne unit there is no front, we're all surrounded. What do you do with what must be a sizable amount of POWs they're taking?
Yes, they corralled quite a number of them. In this case, that was one of the plans for. At least in the 17th Airborne Division, as to how they were going to leverage their glider pilots. And so the glider pilots kind of had a number of missions, some of which were setting up blocking positions on key intersections and things of this nature. Others were responsible for kind of guarding the POWs, if you will. And to be fair, there was a fair amount of Germans who were quite happy to end the war at this point as a POW. You certainly had your zealots who were holding out and making life difficult. But by and large, once they became POWs, they were corralled by these glider pilots. And of course, there's the traditional incidents of guys not taking prisoners that we've seen from both sides. And that was always a spirited debate amongst airborne troops. To your point exactly, is what do you do with prisoners, particularly in the opening moments of a jump like that? You're not organized. You may not even have all your weapons yet. It becomes an interesting decision-making process. Now,
there is a Stewart Stryker, one of the airborne guys, wins the Medal of Honor that day. What's he do to earn his Medal of Honor?
Stewart Stryker was a member of the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment. They had landed kind of off of their zone and were making their way back to their original intended drop zone. And their unit was making a assault against a German compound that was protected on two sides by artillery and supporting machine gun positions and infantry. And as the unit started to advance across open terrain, they came under intense machine gun fire from this position. And Stryker was kind of in the rear of the formation and saw that they were pinned down, and that if they continued to stay in that position, that they were just going to get picked off one by one. And so he kind of from the rear of the position started to advance, yelling at his guys to kind of follow him. He made his way pretty close to the German machine gun position that had them predominantly pinned down, and kind of through his single-handed charge, if you will, kind of got everybody moving. Unfortunately, it cost him his life as he was cut down right after he threw two hand grenades into the German machine gun nest, and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor.
I think it pretty much epitomizes this idea of the aggression of the airborne troops. They might sometimes be under-equipped to do what they do what they need to do with these light troops, but it's made up with the fact that there's an aggression within. And it's not just the Americans, but I mean, I think the Germans and probably the Brits certainly had it as well. But it's just get at them and keep moving. And as he jumps up and charges forward, it's that aggressive, which actually costs them quite dearly in casualties very often at the same time. But they get done what needs to be done.
Absolutely right. I think that's a great observation. I think, the 17th Airborne Division in particular, General Miley loved to give his fight talks to reinforce that exact position of aggressiveness. And it was actually quite a problem for the 17th Airborne Division whenever they were in garrison, because Miley would routinely tell them before he gave them passes that he would rather them come back with a black eye than he didn't want to hear a single story about one of them running from a fight. And so There was a infamous incident where the 17th Airborne Division was banned from London for 2 weeks after they got into a bar fight there. They got into a lot of bar fights when they were after the Bulge, between the Bulge and Varsity. And so they just kind of embraced that spirit. And I think, to your point, it wasn't necessarily unique to American airborne troops. It was something that was instilled upon them because upon landing, it was a potentially unfamiliar situation. You might be by yourself, and they wanted guys to know that what was expected of them was to carry the fight to the enemy, regardless of whether they were by themselves or with their buddies.
So at the close of the 24th of March 1945, had they achieved all their objectives, the Airborne for Varsity?
Absolutely. By and large, with one small exception, and I'm counting here the main objectives that were the important ones were the 3 bridges in the British 6th Airborne Zone and the 10 bridges across the Issel down in the 17th Airborne Zone. Those were still being heavily contested throughout the night, and a number of them had to be destroyed before being seized by the Germans, but they were all in possession. And I think it's telling that when you look at the advances made by 21 Army Group several days later, I'm thinking about March 28th, specifically as they started to move out of that bridgehead and move into their encirclement of the Rhine. The area of farthest advance along that 22-mile front all stemmed from the area where the airborne troops had landed and seized those bridges.
After Varsity, what do they withdraw the airborne potentially for a possible another? I don't know where they might think they might make another drop, but do they withdraw them potentially to be used again? Which I guess they do after Market Garden. They pull them back to get ready to be used again.
In this case, that was one of the ongoing debates with airborne troops. Was do you continue to keep them in the line as light infantry, or do you pull them back and to prepare them for the next opportunity to jump? In this case, both the British 6th and the American 17th basically got attached to various armored units and continued to move forward with the operation to encircle the Ruhr. There were a couple of proposed airborne operations to follow that, one of which was a potential jump into Berlin if the government collapsed there. The 13th Airborne Division that I mentioned earlier was on alert for a number of these jumps that never really materialized. But in the case of Varsity, the 6th and the 17th continued to advance as infantry supporting these British Guards armored units.
Finally, the one tale I missed out is that this story of the OSS team dressed in German uniform and supplied with a Kubelwagen who go in. What's their role? What's that all about?
Yeah, it was an interesting story. So Team Algonquin was a team of OSS agents that were attached to the 18th Airborne Corps as part of their planning process. And the idea was that these OSS agents would go in with the troops, the idea being that they would then manage to get ahead of the troops in many cases in order to report back battlefield conditions and state of the German defenses. And in particular, there was a couple of these guys kind of went in different ways. There was a couple of them that dropped in civilian clothes with suitcases to pose as fleeing civilians. A couple of them dressed up as German troops, to your point. And in the most interesting case, they were dressed up as German troops going in a glider with a captured Kubelwagen. The idea being that they would land on the end of at the edge of one of the drop zones, hop in their Kubelwagen, and then drive off the drop zone and get mixed in with the troops, the German troops, in order to report back intelligence. Always struck me as a very dicey plan. You run the risk of both getting killed by the Germans as you're driving off the drop zone, and of course you run the risk of getting killed by trigger-happy troops who are already on the drop zone and seeing this Kubelwagen drive off, regardless of how many of them they tried to brief beforehand that this was going to happen.
It struck me as being a nuts job because obviously you've got the commando order, so any Allied forces dressed in German uniforms or could be shot or been captured. It's not something I would be at the front of the queue to be volunteering for. And then you do wonder what what realistically effect they could have. But I guess they'd seen the reverse happen during the Battle of the Bulge, which way out of all proportion the disruption they caused those Germans dressed as Americans.
In a lot of ways, if you read the memos of the going into this Team Algonquin, it was in some ways an experiment of the guy that was the commander of the OSS detachment had this idea that a great way to insert agents would be during the pandemonium of an airborne operation, and he got permission to try that as part of Varsity. Interestingly enough, there was also some SOE attempts to do the same thing. It was one of the rare instances where I found documents that were not available in the archives due to the secrets policy. But the idea on the SOE perspective was it was more of how do you insert long-term agents using this pandemonium. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to dig up too much from the SOE perspective. But so theirs was more of an espionage longer term mission, than the OSS was more of an immediate kind of tactical intelligence gathering effort.
Well, that was great, James. Thank you very much. Folks, if you want to know more about Operation Varsity, James's book is 4 Hours of Fury, the untold story of World War II's largest airborne invasion and the final push into Nazi Germany. As ever, I will put a link on the website. Next time we'll be in the Atlantic looking at airborne anti-U-boat operations. But until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.